I swear to God, if I'm not done with this video in 10 minutes, I am going to break my spaghetti before putting them in the pot tonight. So, the stakes for today are very high, so we have to go quite fast with this. What we are doing today is I'm going to give you some numbers, I'm going to give you some data, which you can then go on and parrot around as if you came up with this data yourself, so you can act all smug and knowledgeable about how things are going in the raid. Because we are now 1 month into the season. I thought it's also interesting because we hear more and more often things like the player numbers in the raid are dwindling, there are fewer and fewer players engaging in the raid, as opposed, for example, to more and more players in Mythic Plus. So I thought it was nice to go and check just how exactly true are these statements by comparing the progression in our past few raid tiers. So let's start first with Mythic progression, the more competitive, the more hardcore of the progression amongst the difficulties. For Aberrus at the moment we have about 70-ish guilds killing Sarkareth and 226 defeating the Echo of Neltharion. So this tells you, you can always see just how difficult a boss is by looking at how many kills the previous boss has. For example, if one boss has 1,000 kills and the boss after has 100 kills, it means 900 guilds are still trying to progress on that boss, which means it's a very hard boss. Meanwhile, if a boss has 1,000 kills and the one after has 950 kills, it means it's a very simple boss that you get to kill very quickly. So the ratio is kind of good, kind of healthy for Neltharion and Sarkareth. Now, let's go back to Vault of the Incarnates. What did we have there? We had Diurna at 145 kills 1 month into the season, and Raszageth at a very low 37 kills after 1 month. So, first of all, first things to notice is that the numbers are quite low compared to Aberrus. Usually, what you usually see is the first raid tier having bigger numbers than the second raid tier because you have more players, because you just tend to have a bigger player base at the release of an expansion, right? But then it does get affected by the difficulty of the tier, and arguably, Vault of the Incarnates was a harder tier than Aberrus. So these numbers do show Vault of the Incarnates being harder overall. But how does this compare to Shadowlands, for example? We have Castle the first raid tier of Shadowlands, which follows a similar pattern of Dragonflight because Castle had only 55 kills of Stone Legion generals and 38 kills of the Nathrius 1 month into the season. First thing that you can notice is that the kills of the Nathrius are very high. You can see that they are more than half of the kills of Stone Legion generals. When you look at Raszageth, they are basically a fourth of the kills of Diurna. When you look at Sarkareth, they are a third of the kills of Neltharion. But when you look at the Nathrius, they are 3/4, basically 70% of the kills of Stone Legion generals. That's because if you did not play in Castonatria or did not raid in Castonatria, Stone Legion Generals was the hardest boss in the raid and not the last boss. That's why the numbers are so close to each other. The last of the tiers, the ones to make the cleanest comparison one-to-one, is Sanctum of Domination, because that's the second season, the second raid of Shadowlands compared to the second raid of Dragonflight. You have 211 kills of Kel'Thuzad and 131 kills of Sylvanas 1 month into the season. So the number of kills of Kel'Thuzad are similar to the number of kills of Neltharion, but the number of kills of Sylvanas are almost twice as many of the kills of Sarkareth. However, these are just mythic bosses. You can't really quite tell just how much of the player base, how big of a chunk of the player base is getting into the raid if you just look at the last few bosses in Mythic, because that might not really be representative of the larger part of the player base. That's where you can go and look at Heroic. For Heroic, we can also substitute the second to last boss that we checked right now. So, Stone Legion, Diurna, Kel'Thuzad, and Echo of Neltharion with the first cockblock, the first barrier in the middle of the raid, the first tough boss in the middle of the raid. So, Council of Blood in Castonatria, Painsmith in Sanctum of Domination, Datia in Vault of the Incarnates, and Zeskarn in Aberrus, to see how many guilds have been going into Heroic in this first month of the season compared to the previous seasons. This season we have almost 10,000 guilds in the first month clearing the Skarn, and 5,485 guilds getting rid of Sarkaret. This is in green because, as a spoiler, Sarkaret is the most killed last boss in Heroic out of all of the raids we have been looking so far. The comparison is even funnier when we look at the Heroic of a Vault of the Incarnates, because you have 7,589 kills of Datia, which is going to be the lowest of our mid-tier bosses in terms of kills, and 2,020 kills for Razaget, who is also going to be the lowest of the last bosses in terms of kills. This is a very, very big gap between Sarkaret and Razaget in terms of kill numbers. Even if you assume that the release of Dragonflight had way more players, for example, than now, more players, quit the game, for example, compared to now, still over twice as many, almost 3 times actually, as many guilds have been clearing Heroic Sarkaret compared to Razaget, which is a massive number. The number is not nearly as big for the kills compared to Shadowlands, but still significantly larger, because in Castelnatria you do have 10,416 guilds defeating Council of Blood, so it shows there are still plenty of players going into the raid back in Castelnatria, but 3,632 guilds going through Denatrius in the same time span that 5,500 got through Sarkaret. The numbers lower down in Sanctum of Domination. This one perhaps definitely had to do with the player base quitting from Season 1 of Shadowlands to Season 2. Remember, it took something like 7 months for Blizzard to give us patch 9.1. It was the most delayed first patch of an expansion, basically ever, so definitely hurt the player base in that regard. We had 8,353 guilds defeating Painsmith in the middle of the raid, and then 2,437 guilds defeating Sylvanas as the last boss. Still quite few guilds compared to Sarkaret in terms of progression from the last expansion's second raid. Basically the one-to-one comparison to Dragonflight's second raid. So with these numbers all visible, I wonder which types of conclusions you might come to when you look at the amount of guilds joining the progression of the raids. Do we have way more guilds, 30 to even 50 or 60% of the guilds progressing in Mythic compared to Season 1 of Dragonflight? Do we have almost twice as many guilds progressing in Heroic compared to the first season of Dragonflight? Did we have such few players quitting the game after Season 1 in Dragonflight, given the numbers we see? Or does it just have to do with the raid, this raid, Aberrus, being easier than Vault of the Incarnates? How about the comparison with Shadowlands? We did hear a lot about how many players Shadowlands had on release, quite many, in fact, well over actually 10 million players on release, but then we also heard about the massive drop in players later on in the expansion, right? So is this a good sign to see that the Season 2 of Shadowlands, where many players already started quitting, is still significantly lower in guilds compared to what we see now in Aberrus? Does this mean that the situation is much healthier, right? Much more active in this expansion compared to the second raid of Shadowlands? Or might just this have to do with difficulty? Maybe Sanctum of Domination also being harder than Aberrus simply had guilds progressing more slowly in the raid, even though there were more of them. The final question about these numbers, of course, is what about loot? Because you also have to consider that players might be wanting to get into the raid because of the good stuff they can get. Now, the raid, specifically Heroic raid, was made very, very valuable this expansion because all of the loot that you can find in Heroic, in this tier in particular, in Aberrus, is now able, thanks to the new upgrade system, to be upgraded all the way up to 441 item level. This is something that wasn't there in Vault of the Incarnates, and of course wasn't there in Castelnatria or in Sanctum of Domination. So the value of you continuing to clear Heroic in this expansion and in this season in particular is much, much higher. There might be much more of an incentive for you to continue, or at the very least to repeat the first few weeks, the first month of this season, to go in Heroic, to try to get, for example, juicy pieces like the cloak from Sarkaret, the cool trinkets, the class-specific trinkets from Neltharion, maybe the weapon, the Ashkandur of Neltharion, some other powerful trinkets here and there, like the Rashok trinket for healers, etc, etc. So these are still very valuable, even if you loot them in Heroic version at 441 instead of the Mythic version at 444 or 447, and maybe that is why we have such a larger number of guilds progressing in Heroic as well in this season, in this new raid. Besides this, however, I will still be leaving the conclusions to yourself, whichever is the reason you think for this growth of the raid popularity in this second season of Dragonflight. Whether it is the better expansion with more players, whether it is the better loot, pushing more players to keep joining and participating in the raid, I will leave up the final conclusion to yourselves, guys. So for today, on this Sunday, we are going to leave each other once more. We are thanking first, as usual, all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can still support in plenty of free ways. You can like and comment down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, as well as following me over on my Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I guess we have some midget-sized spaghetti to eat for tonight.